The envelope was empty. Elena counted it 3 times, turning it upside down and shaking it over the table as if the coins might have stuck to the paper. Nothing fell out. Just dust and a receipt from the pharmacy, the one that said her mother's medicine cost more than Elena made in 2 weeks. She sat down on the edge of her narrow bed and pressed both hands flat against her knees to stop them from shaking. Rent was due in 4 days. Her mother needed another refill in 6. The math did not work no matter how many times she rearranged it in her head. A knock rattled the thin door of her rented room. "Elena, open up, it's me." She recognized the voice before the door finished opening. Priya, her friend from the laundry service 2 floors down, pushed inside without waiting for an answer, holding her phone like it was on fire. "You need to see this. I need to see rent money. Do you have that on your phone?" Priya ignored the sharpness in her tone, sitting cross-legged on the floor and turning the screen toward her. An app. Photos of men in tailored shirts, captions promising an evening of company. No questions asked, no strings, just companionship for hire. Elena had heard of these services and whispered jokes among the housemaids, the kind of thing rich, lonely women paid for when husbands traveled too much. Absolutely not. You don't have to sleep with anyone. It's literally called a companion service. You pay, someone shows up, you talk, you eat dinner, they leave. My cousin did it after her divorce. She said it was the first time in a year she felt like a person instead of a problem. Elena laughed, but it came out thin and humorless. "I don't have money to feel like a person, Priya. I have money for medicine, and even that isn't enough. That's exactly why you need this. One night, forget everything. Let someone else carry the weight for 2 hours." Priya scrolled to a profile, a man with dark hair and unreadable eyes, no smile in the photo, just a steady, patient expression that seemed out of place among the others' practiced grins. "This one's cheap tonight, some kind of last-minute booking discount. I can't." "You can, and you're going to, because I already paid the deposit with the $20 I found in your coat pocket while you were in the shower." Elena stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped. "You went through my things. I saved your sanity. You've been crying into your pillow every night this week, thinking I don't hear you through the wall. I hear you. Everyone on this floor probably hears you. So tonight, you are going to sit across from a stranger who has 0 stakes in your life, and just breathe for 1 hour. Consider it charity. From me, to you." There was no winning an argument with Priya once she'd made a decision, and truthfully, Elena didn't have the energy to keep fighting. Exhaustion had settled into her bones weeks ago and never left. She thought of her mother's thin wrists, the cough that wouldn't clear, the landlord's eyes lingering too long on her when she was late with rent. 1 hour of pretending none of that existed sounded, despite everything, like the only thing she actually wanted. "Fine, 1 hour. And you're paying the rest. Deal." The apartment Priya arranged for the meeting wasn't Elena's own cramped room, but a borrowed space belonging to a coworker who was out of town. A small but clean studio with a working heater and curtains that actually closed. Elena stood in the middle of it at 8 in the evening wearing the only dress she owned that didn't have a stain on it, feeling ridiculous, feeling exposed, feeling like she'd agreed to something she couldn't take back. The knock came at exactly 8:15, not a minute early, not a minute late. She opened the door and forgot, for a full 3 seconds, how to speak. He was taller than his photo suggested, with the kind of stillness that made a room feel smaller around him. Dark hair, darker eyes, a black coat that fit him like it had been made specifically for his shoulders and no one else's. He didn't smile the practiced smile she'd expected from a man in this line of work. He simply looked at her, taking her in without rushing, without pretending, in a way that made her suddenly aware of every thread on her second-hand dress. "Elena," he said, not a question. He already knew. "That's me. And you're Kian." Just the one name, offered the way some people offer a hand to shake, simple and final. She stepped aside to let him in, and he moved through the doorway with an economy of motion that struck her as strange for someone whose job description involved performing charm for money. He didn't look around the apartment like he was evaluating it. He looked at her. "You've been crying," he said, once they were both seated, an unreasonable distance apart on the same small sofa. "I have not. Your eyes are doing the thing eyes do the day after crying, slightly swollen, a little redder at the rims than the rest of your face." He said it without judgment, the way someone might comment on weather. "You don't have to tell me why. I'm only saying I noticed." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly furious at how transparent she must have looked. "Is that part of the service? Noticing things?" "No," Kian said. "That's just what I do." They sat in a silence that should have been awkward, and somehow wasn't. Elena had expected forced conversation, empty compliments, maybe some rehearsed line meant to make her feel desired for an hour she was paying for. Instead, Kian asked her, quietly, what she did for work. She told him, the maid service, the wealthy family whose house she cleaned 6 days a week, whose patriarch made comments about her body that she'd learned to walk past like weather, her mother's illness, the medicine that cost more than her paycheck could carry. She hadn't meant to say any of it. The words simply arrived, pulled loose by the strange quiet way he listened, as though every sentence she gave him mattered enough to keep. You counted the coins tonight before you came here, he said. Not a guess, a certainty. How do you know that? Because you keep touching your coat pocket like you're checking that something's still there. It isn't money anymore, it's habit. Elena pulled her hand away from her pocket, embarrassed. You're very observant for someone who gets paid to be charming. Something moved behind his eyes, gone before she could name it. Charm is easy. Most people don't want charm, they want to be seen. There's a difference. And you can just see people? Just like that? Some people are louder than they know they are. His gaze didn't waver from hers. You are one of them. You've spent so long being quiet for other people's comfort, you don't realize how much you're saying just by sitting still. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept locked for longer than she could remember. And to her horror, her eyes filled without permission. She turned her face away, humiliated, expecting him to fill the silence with something smooth and practiced, to smooth over the awkwardness of a crying woman on a rented sofa. He didn't. He simply waited, hands loosely folded, giving her the room to feel what she was feeling without an audience's pressure attached to it. I'm sorry, she said finally, wiping her face with the back of her hand. This isn't what you're paid for. You'd be surprised what I'm actually paid for. A faint, almost private amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Most nights, people pay me to fill silence they're afraid of. Tonight you filled it yourself. That's rarer than you think. They talked for the better part of an hour after that, about small things, about nothing important, the kind of conversation that costs nothing and somehow gives everything. Elena found herself laughing twice, real laughter, unguarded. And each time she caught herself, she felt a small flush of surprise that laughter was still something her body remembered how to do. When the hour ended, Kian rose to leave with the same quiet economy he'd arrived with. At the door he paused, looking back at her the way a person looks at something they intend to remember. Take care of your mother, he said, and yourself. In that order, if you must, but don't forget the second one entirely. I don't even know your last name. You don't need it, he said. Not tonight. Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with a softness that felt, absurdly, like the gentlest thing that had happened to her all year. Elena sat alone in the borrowed apartment for a long while after he left, staring at the door, replaying the strange gravity of a man who had asked for nothing and given, somehow, more than she'd paid for. She told herself it meant nothing. A performance, a service rendered by someone skilled enough to make loneliness feel, for 1 hour, like company. She gathered her coat, turned off the lamp, and walked home through streets gone quiet with the late hour, the cold air doing little to clear the strange warmth that had settled behind her ribs. Whatever this had been, she thought, it was over now. 1 hour, one stranger, one evening bought with the last coins she had to spare. She had no way of knowing, as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room and fell into bed still wearing her coat, that the money on the nightstand she'd left behind for him had been quietly doubled and tucked back into her own coat pocket sometime during that hour, without her noticing his hands ever near it. She had no way of knowing that the man who called himself Kian did not, in fact, need money at all. She had no way of knowing that somewhere across the city, in a house with iron gates and old stone walls that no map fully explained, an entire court sat waiting for a king who had once again disappeared into the human world without explanation, the way he did every few months when the weight of the crown became unbearable enough that he needed, if only for one evening, to be looked at by someone who had no idea what he was. She only knew that when she closed her eyes that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream about rent, or medicine, or her mother's cough, or the coins she no longer had. She dreamed about dark eyes that noticed everything, and asked for nothing in return. In the morning, the money was there, more than she'd left. No note beside it, nothing to explain the extra bills folded so precisely they looked untouched by human hands. Elena stared at it for a long time before she finally picked it up, telling herself it was a mistake, an overpayment, something to be corrected the next time she saw Priya. She told herself a lot of things that morning. None of them explained why, 3 days later, she still found herself standing at the window each evening around 8:15, watching the street below, waiting for a knock that never came. Elena did not tell Priya about the extra money. She did not tell her about the window, or the 8:15 habit that had crept into her evenings without permission, or the way she kept catching herself listening for footsteps on the stairwell that belonged to no one who lived in her building. She told herself the silence was easier to carry alone. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th day, her mother's cough turned into something wetter, something that rattled when she breathed, and Elena spent the extra money on a doctor's visit she couldn't otherwise have afforded. The doctor prescribed a stronger medicine, more expensive than the last, and said the word pneumonia in a tone that made Elena's stomach fold in on itself. She went to work the next morning with her eyes stinging from lack of sleep, scrubbing floors in the enormous house of the Vance family. A household so large it employed 6 full-time staff just to keep its surfaces gleaming for a family that rarely acknowledged any of them existed. Mr. Vance, in particular, had a habit of finding reasons to linger near Elena that made her skin crawl, complimenting her in ways that weren't really compliments, standing just slightly too close when he handed her his coffee cup. That morning was worse than most. He cornered her in the hallway outside his study, close enough that she could smell the whiskey already on his breath despite the early hour, and made a comment about her dress that had nothing to do with cleaning. Elena stepped back, mumbled an excuse about needing to finish the linens, and fled to the laundry room where she stood over the sink with shaking hands until her heartbeat slowed. She didn't cry. She'd used up her tears 3 days ago on a rented sofa in front of a stranger. There was nothing left today but a tight, cold anger that she folded up small and tucked away, the way she folded everything that threatened to spill over into a life that had no room for spilling. The delivery came at noon. Mrs. Vance, in one of her rare moments of practicality, decided the household needed extra linens for a dinner party the following week, and rather than send one of her own staff across town, she instructed Elena to run the errand to a private estate whose housekeeper had apparently offered a generous batch of fine imported sheets at a discount, some arrangement between the two households that Elena didn't fully understand and wasn't paid enough to ask about. "Take the car," Mrs. Vance said, waving a hand vaguely toward the garage. "Tell them the Vance house sent you. They're expecting someone." The estate sat 20 minutes outside the city, behind gates so tall and so old that Elena felt smaller just standing at the entrance waiting for someone to buzz her through. When the gates finally opened, the driveway stretched on longer than she expected, curving past manicured hedges shaped into forms she didn't recognize, animals maybe, or something older than animals, until the house itself came into view. It wasn't a house. It was closer to a fortress dressed up as a home, gray stone walls climbing 3 stories high, windows deep set like watching eyes, a front door large enough to admit a carriage. Elena parked where a groundskeeper directed her and climbed out slowly, hugging the folder of paperwork Mrs. Vance had given her against her chest like a shield. A woman met her at a side entrance, older, sharp-eyed, dressed in the crisp black uniform of someone who ran a household rather than simply worked in one. She introduced herself as Margaret, the head housekeeper, and led Elena through a maze of hallways toward the linen stores without much conversation, the kind of brisk efficiency Elena recognized from women who'd spent decades managing large homes and larger secrets. They were passing a wide corridor near what looked like a private study when a door opened ahead of them, and a man stepped out mid-sentence, speaking to someone still inside the room, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone used to being listened to without needing to raise his tone. Elena's feet stopped moving before her mind caught up with why. It was him. Kian. Except he wasn't wearing the plain dark coat from the rented apartment. He wore a suit the color of deep water, cut so precisely it looked like it had grown onto his shoulders rather than been sewn there, and 2 men flanked him at a respectful half-step behind, both of them straightening slightly whenever he shifted his weight, both of them watching him with an attentiveness that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with rank. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For one suspended second, nothing in the hallway moved. Margaret continued speaking about linen counts and delivery schedules, utterly oblivious to the way the air between Elena and the man in the doorway had gone thick and strange. Charged with a recognition neither of them could explain to the housekeeper without unraveling something neither of them was ready to unravel. Kian's expression did not shift into the polite blankness of a stranger politely acknowledging staff. Something flickered across his face instead, quick and complicated. Something that looked almost like the ground shifting beneath a man who prided himself on never losing his footing. "Margaret," he said, his voice even, though Elena caught the faintest edge beneath it. "Give us a moment." "Sir? The linens can wait 5 minutes. I need to speak with the young woman from the Vance house." Margaret's eyebrows rose a fraction, the only crack in her professional composure, but she nodded and stepped back toward the linen room without argument. leaving Elena standing in the hallway alone with a man she had last seen leaving a rented studio apartment, with nothing more than a first name and a folded stack of bills he hadn't taken with him. The two men flanking Kian exchanged a glance Elena couldn't read, and withdrew several steps down the corridor, close enough to remain within call, far enough to grant an illusion of privacy. "You work for the Vance family," Kian said quietly, once they were alone, or as alone as anyone in that house seemed to get. "I clean their floors, yes." Elena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "I didn't know you." She gestured vaguely at the suit, the hallway, the enormous stone house around them, unable to find words that captured the scale of what she was trying to ask. "I didn't know any of this." "I know. Is this your house?" Something in his jaw tightened. "It's complicated." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Elena felt her earlier anger, the same cold, tight thing she'd tucked away after Mr. Vance's hallway comments, rise up again. Except this time, it had somewhere new to go. "You let me think you needed the money. You let me talk about my mother, about my job, about everything, while sitting in a rented apartment pretending to be some kind of paid companion. Was that a joke to you? Some kind of game rich people play, dressing up as someone ordinary for an evening?" "It wasn't a game." His voice hardened, not with anger at her, but with something that sounded closer to frustration at himself. "And I wasn't pretending to be interested in what you said. Everything I told you that night was true. My name is true. What I felt in that room was true." "Then explain this." She swept a hand toward the hallway, the stone walls, the men waiting a respectful distance away like sentries. "Explain why a man who apparently lives in a fortress needed to pay for company from a service meant for lonely housewives and divorced men." Kian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Elena thought he wouldn't answer at all, long enough that Margaret's footsteps could be heard shifting impatiently near the linen room, long enough that the two men down the hall exchanged another look, this one carrying something closer to concern than curiosity. "There are things about my life," he said finally, each word chosen with obvious care, "that I cannot explain to you standing in this hallway. Not because I don't trust you, because explaining it here, now, would put you somewhere I don't want you to be." "That sounds like a threat." "It isn't a threat. It's the opposite of one." He stepped closer, close enough that Elena had to tilt her head back slightly to hold his gaze, close enough that she caught, beneath the tailored suit and the composed authority, the same steady attention he'd given her on the rented sofa, the same way of looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a room full of moving things. "I need you to trust me on this, even though I know I haven't earned it yet. Don't tell anyone what you saw here today, not Priya, not the Vance family, not anyone." "Why would I keep a secret for a man who lied to me?" "Because the alternative," he said quietly, "is more dangerous than you understand, and I would rather you be angry with me than in danger because of me." Before Elena could respond, Margaret reappeared at the end of the hallway, her patience visibly thinning, and the moment collapsed back into ordinary time, into linen counts and delivery schedules, and a young maid who had a job to finish and a bus to catch home. "Later," Kian said, low enough that only she could hear it. "I'll explain later. I promise you that much." "Later isn't good enough. It's what I have to offer right now." Something almost like pain crossed his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Please, just this once. Trust me without an explanation." Elena looked at him for a long moment, torn between the fury simmering in her chest and the strange, stubborn pull that had kept her standing at her window every evening at 8:15 for the better part of a week. In the end, she said nothing at all, simply turned and followed Margaret toward the linen room, leaving Kian standing alone in the hallway with his two silent attendants and whatever secret he'd asked her to carry without explaining its weight. She loaded the linens into the Vance car in silence, drove back across the city with her hands tight on the wheel, and said nothing to anyone about what she'd seen, though she couldn't have said, if pressed, whether her silence was loyalty or simply the shock of not knowing what words to use for something she didn't yet understand. That night, for the first time all week, she didn't stand at her window at 8:15. She sat on her bed instead, staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on his face when he'd said please, and wondering exactly what kind of world she'd accidentally wandered into the moment she spent her last coins on a stranger who noticed everything and explained nothing. Priya noticed something was different the moment Elena walked into the laundry room the next morning, though it took her 3 tries to get an actual answer out of her. "You've got a face on," Priya said, folding towels with the automatic speed of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "The face you make when something happened and you've decided not to tell me about it." "Nothing happened." "Elena, I have known you since we were both scrubbing toilets for the same terrible agency 5 years ago. I know your nothing happened face. It is currently on display. Elena kept her eyes on the sheet she was folding, focusing on getting the corners perfectly square, the kind of small, controllable task that let her avoid a larger conversation. I saw him again. The man from the service. Priya's hands stopped moving entirely. You saw Kian? Where? At a house I made a delivery to, for the Vance family. Elena hesitated, weighing how much to say, remembering his request in the hallway, the strange gravity in his voice when he'd said please. It's a big house, really big. He works there, I think, or lives there. I'm not totally sure which. Define big. Gates, grounds, staff, the kind of place that has a person whose only job is managing linens. Priya's mouth fell open. You're telling me the man I booked off a companion app for $40 actually lives in a mansion? I don't know what I'm telling you. I don't understand it myself. Elena finally looked up, and whatever Priya saw on her face made her set down the towel she'd been folding and give Elena her full attention. He asked me not to tell anyone. Said it could be dangerous if people knew. Dangerous how? Is he in some kind of trouble? Debt? Criminal stuff? I don't know. He wouldn't explain. He just said please, and something about the way he said it made me actually listen. Priya studied her for a long moment, the teasing edge draining slowly out of her expression. You like him? I don't even know him. That's not what I asked. Elena didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer, and Priya, mercifully, let the silence stand without pushing further, though the knowing look on her face said the conversation was far from finished. The rest of the week passed in the ordinary grind of the Vance household, floors scrubbed, linens changed, Mr. Vance's attention growing bolder in small increments that Elena tracked the way a person tracks weather before a storm, careful to always have an exit route planned. She said nothing to Mrs. Vance, who would not have believed her, or worse, would have believed her and blamed Elena for it regardless. On Thursday, Mrs. Vance announced a change in plans. The dinner party requiring the borrowed linens had been moved up, and the household whose gates Elena had driven through days earlier had apparently offered to send additional serving staff for the evening, as a courtesy between two families whose social circles overlapped in ways Elena didn't fully understand, and had long since stopped trying to. You'll be assisting in the kitchen that night, Mrs. Vance informed her, checking something off a list without looking up. Extra hands are always useful when we're entertaining. Elena spent the days leading up to the dinner in a state of low, persistent tension, uncertain whether she wanted Kian to be among the additional staff sent that evening, or desperately hoped he wouldn't be. Both possibilities felt equally unbearable in different ways. He wasn't among the staff. Of course he wasn't, she told herself while arranging trays of appetizers in the Vance kitchen the night of the dinner, feeling foolish for the small twist of disappointment that settled in her chest anyway. Men like him, whatever exactly he was, didn't carry trays. Other people carried trays for men like him. The dinner party stretched late into the evening, course after course, wine flowing freely enough that the guests grew louder and looser as the hours wore on. Elena moved through the kitchen and dining room in the practiced invisibility of household staff, refilling glasses, clearing plates, absorbing snippets of conversation that meant nothing to her until, near the end of the evening, one name rose above the general chatter, loud enough to catch her attention completely. The Alpha King himself, if you can believe it, one of the guests was saying, a woman in a shimmering green dress leaning conspiratorially toward her table mates. My cousin works event security for one of the northern packs. She says he's been slipping away from court more and more lately, disappearing for entire evenings, sometimes longer, and coming back looking like a man who's been somewhere he shouldn't have. Kian Ashgrove disappearing, another guest said, half laughing, half scandalized. The most disciplined ruler in 3 generations, sneaking around like a teenager. I'd pay to see it. Elena's hands went very still around the pitcher of water she was holding. They say he's been going into the human world, the woman in green continued, lowering her voice further, though not far enough to keep Elena from hearing every word, as she hovered near the table refilling glasses no one had asked her to refill. Can you imagine, the head of an entire pack system, wandering around among humans who have no idea what he actually is? My cousin thinks he's looking for something. Or someone. Looking for what, exactly? A human wife? The court would never allow it. The court doesn't get a say in what the Alpha King does in his private hours. That's rather the point of being the Alpha King. Elena set the water pitcher down with more care than the moment strictly required, her mind racing back through every strange detail of the hallway encounter days earlier, the stone fortress dressed up as a house, the 2 men flanking him with the deference of soldiers rather than colleagues. The word please, spoken like it cost him something to say. Alpha King. She didn't know exactly what the phrase meant, Not fully. Not with any real understanding of packs or courts or whatever hierarchy the guests were casually discussing over their wine glasses, as though it were as ordinary as stock prices. But she understood enough. Enough to know that Kian was not merely wealthy. Enough to know that whatever world he belonged to, it wasn't one built for people like her, standing at the edges with a water pitcher, invisible until someone wanted their glass refilled. She finished her shift in a fog, going through the motions of clearing the final course, helping stack dishes in the kitchen, accepting her modest pay from Mrs. Vance's assistant with a numb nod. It wasn't until she was on the late bus home, forehead pressed against the cold window glass, that the full weight of what she'd overheard finally settled into something she could actually think about clearly. A king. Not a metaphor, not a nickname for some wealthy businessman who liked being addressed grandly by his staff. An actual king, of an actual system of power she'd never known existed, hiding among ordinary people for reasons his own guests speculated about over wine without ever landing on the truth. Looking for something, or someone. Elena thought about the way he'd listened to her that first night, the quiet, careful attention he'd paid to every word she said, as though she were the most important person in the room. She thought about the money doubled and returned without explanation, the pleas in the hallway, the flicker of something almost like fear crossing his composed face when he'd asked her to keep his secret. She didn't know what to do with any of it. She only knew, lying awake that night with her mother's uneven breathing audible through the thin wall between their rooms, that whatever she'd stumbled into the night she spent her last coins on a stranger, it was far larger and far stranger than anything she'd bargained for, and there was no simple way to unspend those coins now. The knock on Elena's door came on a Sunday, the one day of the week she allowed herself to sleep past 6, and she opened it still half-dressed in yesterday's clothes to find Margaret, the sharp-eyed housekeeper from the Stone estate, standing in the narrow hallway of her building, looking distinctly out of place among the peeling paint and flickering light fixtures. "Miss Torres?" Margaret's voice carried the same brisk efficiency Elena remembered from the linen room, though something in her expression had softened slightly, some crack of humanity showing through the professional armor. "May I come in?" "How do you know where I live?" "The Vance household keeps records of its staff addresses for payroll purposes. I asked a favor of someone who had access to those records." Margaret didn't wait for permission, stepping past Elena into the small room with the air of someone who'd walked into far worse and remained unbothered. "I won't take much of your time." Elena closed the door, suddenly conscious of the cracked ceiling, the single window that didn't fully close, the overall smallness of a life Margaret's employer could probably have purchased outright without noticing the expense. "Did he send you?" "He doesn't know I'm here." Margaret's eyes swept the room once, cataloging without judgment, before settling back on Elena. "I've worked for the Ashgrove family for 11 years. I watched that man become Alpha King at an age when most people are still finishing their studies, and I have watched the position slowly take apart every ordinary thing that might have made him happy. I'm not here on his behalf. I'm here because I'm tired of watching him disappear into the human world every few months looking for something he can't seem to find. And then I saw his face in that hallway when he looked at you, and it was the first time in longer than I can remember that he looked like something other than exhausted." Elena sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, unsure what to do with her hands. "I don't understand any of this. Alpha King, packs, courts. 3 days ago I thought werewolves were something from movies my little cousins watched. They're not from movies." Margaret said it plainly, without drama, the way someone announces the weather. "They're old. Older than most human institutions, and Kian sits at the head of one of the largest and most powerful of them, has done since he was barely 20, inheriting a throne he never asked for after his father died, in circumstances the court still argues about in private. He has spent his entire adult life being watched, managed and measured by people who see him as a symbol first and a person somewhere further down the list. And the companion service, the paid company, that's how a king relaxes?" Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched Margaret's mouth. "It's how a man who has never once, in an entire day, spoken to without an agenda attached, finds a few hours where someone simply talks to him, because they want to, not because they're angling for his favor or his money or his bloodline. He's done it before. Different services, different cities, always careful, always brief. He usually leaves before anyone remembers his face clearly enough to matter. But this time he came back. This time, Margaret said, he came back 3 separate times to stand outside your building at 8:15 in the evening, and never once worked up the nerve to knock." Elena's breath caught somewhere in her chest. "He what? You weren't standing at your window as often as you think you were unwatched, Miss Torres." Margaret's eyes carried something almost gentle now, a warmth that hadn't been visible in the stone hallway days before. He asked me, in a roundabout way that he thought was subtle, and was not remotely subtle, whether I thought a human woman could ever understand a world like ours enough to want to stay in it, once she knew the truth. I told him the only way to find out was to ask her directly, instead of asking me. He has not yet found the courage to take that advice, which is frankly ridiculous for a man who commands armies. Despite everything, despite the strangeness pressing in from every direction, Elena felt an unexpected laugh escape her, quick and surprised. He's afraid of me? He's afraid of losing something he hasn't fully allowed himself to hope for yet. Margaret rose from where she'd perched at the edge of the small table, smoothing her skirt with the same brisk efficiency that had carried her through the entire visit. I'm not here to convince you of anything, Miss Torres. Your feelings are your own, and this world, once you understand more of it, is not without its dangers, particularly for a human standing too close to a king. I simply thought you deserved to know the truth before you decided anything, rather than being left to guess in the dark the way you have been since that hallway. What kind of dangers? Margaret's expression sobered. There are factions within the court who believe the Alpha King's bloodline should remain unmixed, who see any human connection as a weakness to be exploited, rather than a choice to be respected. There are rivals who have been maneuvering for years to arrange a political marriage that would strengthen their own standing through his throne. If word spreads that he has taken a personal interest in a human woman, you would not simply be ignored. You would become a target, whether you wanted the position or not. The warmth in Elena's chest cooled slightly at that, replaced by something more clear-eyed and cautious. So the safest thing I could do is forget any of this happened. The safest thing, Margaret agreed. Whether it's the right thing is a different question, and one I can't answer for you. She left shortly after that, refusing Elena's offer of tea with a small, almost kind shake of her head, disappearing down the narrow stairwell as efficiently as she'd arrived. Elena sat alone in her room for a long while afterward, turning the conversation over in her mind, weighing the strange mixture of fear and something warmer that had settled into her chest and refused to leave. That evening, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Elena did not wait at her window. Instead, at 8:10 she put on her coat, walked down the narrow stairwell, and stood on the sidewalk outside her building, watching the street in both directions with her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold. At 8:15 exactly, a car she didn't recognize slowed at the corner, dark and unassuming despite what she now suspected was probably an enormous amount of money represented under its plain exterior, and the passenger door opened before it had fully stopped. Kian stepped out looking, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain, as though he hadn't planned for the possibility that she might already be standing there waiting. "Margaret told you," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Margaret told me a great deal." Elena kept her voice steady, despite the pounding in her chest. "Alpha King, Pax, rivals who'd like to use me against you. Enough to make anyone reconsider standing on a cold sidewalk waiting for a stranger who's apparently been driving past this building for weeks too afraid to knock." Something flickered across his face. Embarrassment layered under something rawer. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again after the hallway." "I wasn't sure either." Elena took a step closer. Close enough to see the tightness at the corners of his eyes. The exhaustion Margaret had described, settling into someone who was never allowed to simply rest. "But I'm standing here anyway, so I suppose we're both finding out together. I should have told you the truth from the start." "You should have. But I understand a little better now why you didn't." She wrapped her coat tighter against the cold, holding his gaze without flinching. "I want the truth now, though. All of it, not later, not eventually. Now, or I walk back inside and we forget this ever started." Kian studied her for a long moment, something in his expression settling, deciding, the last of his hesitation folding away into something steadier. "Then let's walk," he said. "It's a long story, and I'd rather tell it somewhere. The cold doesn't make you shiver quite so hard." They walked together down the quiet street, and for the first time since the coins had run out and the envelope had come up empty, Elena felt something other than fear at the size of the unknown stretching out ahead of her. They ended up at an all-night diner 3 blocks from Elena's building, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell above the door that jingled every time someone came in from the cold, chosen deliberately, Elena suspected, because it was the kind of ordinary place no one would ever think to look for a king. Kian ordered coffee for both of them without asking, then seemed to catch himself and pushed the second cup toward her, with an apologetic tilt of his head. "Old habit. I forget not everyone wants what I want. It's fine. I like coffee." Elena wrapped her hands around the warm cup, grateful for something to hold. "Tell me. All of it, like you promised." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his starting point the way a man chooses footing on unfamiliar ground. "My father was Alpha King before me. A good one by most accounts. though I was young enough when he died that most of what I know of his reign comes from other people's memories rather than my own. He died when I was 19, in an accident the court still debates in private, though the official record calls it exactly that, an accident. You don't believe it was? I don't know what I believe. I was 19, and suddenly responsible for an entire system of pacts, stretching across half the continent, surrounded by advisors who'd known my father for decades, and measured me against him every single day. There wasn't time to grieve properly. There was only time to learn, fast, how to hold a throne before someone decided I couldn't. That sounds lonely. It is the loneliest thing I've ever known. He said it simply, without self-pity, the way a person states a fact they've made peace with. Every conversation I have carries weight I didn't ask for. Every person who speaks to me wants something, even the ones who love me, even the ones who mean well. My mother wants grandchildren to secure the bloodline. My advisors want alliances through marriage. My rivals want any excuse to paint me as unfit. There is no version of my day where someone looks at me and simply sees a person rather than a position. Elena thought of Priya's app, the profile photo with the unreadable eyes, the discount that had made the booking cheap enough for her last coins to cover. So you started paying strangers to talk to you. I started paying strangers to forget, for an hour, what I am. A faint, tired smile touched his mouth. It's pathetic, I know. A king who has to buy an evening of being ordinary. It's not pathetic. Elena's voice came out firmer than she expected. I understand needing an hour where no one wants anything from you. I've spent years being invisible in other people's houses, quiet enough not to be noticed, careful enough not to give anyone a reason to look at me twice. It's exhausting in its own way. I imagine being seen too much, all the time, by people who only want something from you, is its own kind of exhausting too. Something in his shoulders loosened, some tension she hadn't fully registered until it eased. That night in the apartment, when you talked about your mother, about the medicine, about the man you work for who makes you uncomfortable, you weren't performing anything. You were just tired and honest. And it was the first honest conversation I'd had in longer than I could count. And the money you left, more than I'd paid. I didn't want you counting coins again anytime soon. He said it plainly, no embarrassment in the admission. It wasn't charity. It was gratitude, if that makes sense. You gave me something I didn't know I still needed. I wanted to give something back. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the diner's ancient jukebox playing something low and forgotten in the corner. The bell above the door jingling occasionally as late-night regulars drifted in and out without noticing the two of them tucked into their corner booth. What happens now? Elena finally asked. Margaret said there are people in your world who would see me as a target if they knew you'd taken an interest in me. That sounds like a warning, not an invitation. It's both. Kian's jaw tightened slightly. There is a faction within the court, led by a man named Desmond Ashgrove, my father's younger brother, who has spent years positioning his own children as more suitable heirs than me. He would use any perceived weakness, any human connection, as ammunition to argue I'm unfit to rule, distracted from the bloodline's interests by outside attachments. If he learned about you, he wouldn't simply object. He would act, and not gently. So the smart thing is to stay away from you. The smart thing, Kian agreed, echoing Margaret's earlier words with a wry twist to his mouth, would be exactly that. But I drove past your building 3 times before I found the nerve to actually knock on your door. And even then, you were the one waiting on the sidewalk instead. I've spent years doing the smart thing, Elena. Every choice I've made since I was 19 has been calculated for the good of the pack, the stability of the throne, the expectations of a court that would rather I be a symbol than a man. I would like, for once, to make a choice simply because I want to, and see where it leads, rather than where it's expected to. Elena studied him across the small table, weighing the fear Margaret had planted against the warmth that had settled into her chest weeks ago, and refused to be talked out of staying there. I don't know anything about your world. I don't know how to navigate courts, or factions, or whatever politics come with being close to someone like you. Neither did I. Once, I learned. You could too, if you wanted to. That's a big if. It is. He held her gaze steadily, none of the careful composure from the hallway visible now, just quiet, uncertain hope. I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm only asking you not to close the door before you've had the chance to decide anything at all. Elena thought of her mother's uneven breathing through the thin wall, the medicine that cost more than she earned, the small, hard-won stability she'd built her entire life around protecting. She thought of the coins she'd spent on a stranger who'd turned out to be a king, and the strange, persistent warmth that had settled into her chest the moment he'd first looked at her like she mattered. Okay, she said finally. I won't close the door, not yet. Something in his face eased into an expression she hadn't seen from him before, unguarded and openly relieved. The composed authority of the Alpha King momentarily giving way entirely to a man who had simply been afraid of being told no. Outside the diner window, the city moved through its ordinary late-night rhythms. Taxis and delivery trucks and the occasional pedestrian hurrying against the cold, entirely unaware that inside the small diner, a king and a maid were quietly deciding to risk everything neither of them fully understood yet, for the sake of something that had started with a handful of desperate coins and somehow become the most important thing in either of their lives. Word travels strangely in a household staffed by people who notice everything and are paid to say nothing about most of it, and by the time Elena arrived for her shift at the Vance house 3 days later, the whispers had already reached the kitchen ahead of her. "You were seen," Priya hissed the moment Elena set down her bag, glancing over her shoulder toward the doorway, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Getting into a car outside your building. Some fancy black car that definitely doesn't belong on our street. One of the drivers from the agency saw it and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone else. And now half the staff in this house thinks you've got a secret boyfriend with money. It's not like that. Elena, I don't care what it's like. I care that Mrs. Vance's assistant asked me this morning, very casually, whether I knew anything about the Ashgrove estate taking a personal interest in one of the Vance staff. That is not a casual question. That is the kind of question people ask when they're trying to figure out whether there's information worth selling." Elena's stomach dropped. Selling to who? I don't know. But rich households gossip like anyone else, and gossip about the Ashgrove family isn't ordinary gossip. Everyone in this circle knows that name means money and power on a scale most of us can't even imagine. If someone puts together that you're connected to them, even a little, people are going to start paying attention to you in ways you really do not want. Elena spent the rest of her shift with a low hum of anxiety running underneath every task, scrubbing floors with unusual intensity, arranging linens with hands that wouldn't quite settle. By the time she left that evening, she'd convinced herself the whispers were probably nothing, ordinary curiosity that would fade within a week once something more interesting caught the household's attention. She was wrong. The email arrived 2 days later, sent to an account she barely used, from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line reading simply, "A warning, from someone who wishes you well." Elena read it standing in her kitchen with her coat still on, the cold evening air still clinging to her clothes. "Miss Torres," the email began, "you do not know me, and it is better for both of us that it remains that way. I write only to inform you that certain individuals within a particular household have become aware of your recent connection to a man of considerable standing. I would advise you, for your own safety, to end whatever has begun between you as quickly and quietly as possible. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again without consequence, and I do not believe you understand yet the scale of what stands to lose patience with your presence." There was no signature, no further explanation. Just the quiet, chilling certainty of someone who knew far more about her life than any stranger reasonably should. She called Kian that night, her hands shaking as she read the email aloud over the phone, and the silence on the other end stretched long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "Kian?" "I'm here." His voice had gone hard in a way she hadn't heard before, controlled fury layered under careful composure. "Forward me that email, now if you can. Do you know who sent it? I have a strong suspicion. And if I'm right, it means Desmond's people have moved faster than I expected." He exhaled slowly, and she could hear him pacing on the other end, footsteps against what sounded like hardwood floor. "I should have anticipated this. I should have put protections around you the moment I decided to see you again, instead of assuming we had more time to be careful." "What kind of protections?" "Security for a start, discreet but present, and I need to have a conversation with my uncle sooner rather than later. One that makes very clear where I stand on the matter of threats made against people I care about." Elena sat down slowly at her small kitchen table, the email still glowing on her phone screen. "Kian, I'm scared. I know." His voice softened, some of the hardness giving way to something gentler, though the underlying urgency remained. "And I hate that I'm the reason for that fear. I want you to know I take this seriously. You are not a complication to be managed quietly. You are not a mistake I'm going to correct by stepping back. Whoever sent this email is going to learn very quickly that threatening you is not a strategy that ends well for them." "That almost sounds like a threat of your own." "It is," Kian said simply. "I told you once that most of my choices are calculated for the good of the pack. This one isn't calculated at all. It's simply true. I am not going to let anyone frighten you out of a life you're choosing for yourself." Despite the fear still sitting cold in her stomach, Elena felt something steady settle alongside it. a kind of quiet reassurance she hadn't expected to find in the middle of an anonymous threat. What do I do in the meantime? Go about your ordinary routine. Don't change your schedule in ways that would suggest you're frightened, because that only tells them the threat landed. I'll have someone discreetly nearby whenever you're not at the Vance house, someone you won't even notice unless you're looking for them. And Elena, he paused, and she could hear the weight of what came next before he said it. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, call me immediately. Don't wait to be certain. Trust the feeling first, and sort out the details after. She agreed, though sleep came slowly that night, her mind circling the email's careful, chilling phrasing, the certainty in its author's tone that she was already too deep into something dangerous to simply walk away from unscathed. The following morning, walking to the bus stop for her shift at the Vance house, Elena noticed a man on the opposite side of the street who fell into step at roughly the same pace as her own, close enough to be nearby, far enough to seem unremarkable to anyone not specifically looking for him. She caught his eye once, briefly, and he gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement rather than a greeting, before returning his attention to the street around them both. Kian had kept his word. Someone was watching, quietly, the way a person watches over something they intend to protect rather than control. It should have felt suffocating, she thought, having a stranger trail her through her ordinary day, because an anonymous email had decided she was now a target in a world of politics and power she barely understood. Instead, walking those familiar streets with a silent guardian a careful distance away, Elena felt something she hadn't expected to feel amid the fear. She felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that someone with real power in the world had decided her safety mattered enough to spend that power protecting it. Whatever came next, whatever Desmond Ashgrove and his faction intended by that carefully worded warning, Elena understood now that she was no longer navigating this alone, and that understanding, fragile as it was, gave her the courage to keep walking forward instead of turning back. The meeting with Desmond happened faster than Elena expected, though she wasn't present for it, only heard the account afterward from Kian, sitting across from her in the same diner booth that had become, in the span of a few short weeks, something like their private corner of an otherwise complicated world. He denied sending the email, of course, Kian said, stirring his coffee without drinking it, a habit she'd noticed he had when his thoughts were elsewhere. But denial from Desmond means very little. He's never once admitted to anything directly. He simply arranges circumstances and lets other people take the blame when they unravel. Do you believe him? No, but proving it is a different matter, and without proof, accusing him outright only gives him grounds to claim I'm persecuting family out of paranoia, which plays rather well with the more conservative members of the court, who already think I'm too soft to hold the throne properly. Kian finally took a sip of the coffee, grimacing slightly at its cooled temperature. What I can do is make it clear, publicly enough that word travels back to him, that any further action against you will be treated as an action against the throne itself. That tends to discourage even Desmond's more aggressive instincts, at least temporarily. Temporarily isn't forever. No, he agreed. It isn't. Elena turned her cup slowly between her hands, watching the ripples in the dark liquid rather than his face, working up the courage for the question that had been sitting in her chest since the email arrived. Margaret mentioned a political marriage. Someone your court wants you to consider, to strengthen your standing. Kian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Lyra Voss, daughter of one of the strongest northern packs, close to my own age, perfectly suited by bloodline and standing to be exactly the kind of match my advisors have wanted for years. Is she someone you'd consider, if I weren't in the picture? I've met Lyra exactly 4 times in my life, always at formal court functions, always surrounded by advisors steering the conversation toward exactly the topics they want discussed. She's perfectly pleasant. She's also, as far as I can tell, entirely uninterested in me as a person, and entirely interested in what marrying the Alpha King would mean for her family's standing. It would be a merger, not a marriage. He met Elena's eyes directly. I have spent my entire adult life being told that feelings are a luxury a king cannot afford. I am, for perhaps the first time, choosing not to believe that. Even with everything it costs, the threats, the factions, the danger to people around you, especially with all of that. His voice carried a quiet conviction that steadied something anxious in her chest. If I let fear of Desmond dictate every choice I make, then he has already won, regardless of who ends up wearing a crown. I would rather fight for something I actually want than spend my life managing a throne I never chose in the first place, purely to keep people like him comfortable. They sat in silence for a moment, the diner's ancient jukebox cycling through another forgotten song, the late hour thinning the crowd around them until it felt, briefly, like they were the only two people left in the world. "There's something else," Kian said eventually, his voice dropping into a register she hadn't heard from him before, careful and deliberate. "Something I haven't told you yet, because I wasn't sure how to say it without frightening you further." Elena's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "The full moon gathering happens in 3 weeks. It's the largest formal event in our calendar, when every pack leader across the territory gathers to renew alliances, settle disputes, and, this year in particular, discuss succession matters given how vocal Desmond has become about questioning my fitness to rule." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "Tradition dictates that any personal companion of the Alpha King be formally presented at the gathering, acknowledged before the full court. There's no way to keep our connection private indefinitely, not once the gathering approaches. Either I present you formally, which invites every kind of scrutiny imaginable, or I don't, which will be read by the entire court as confirmation that whatever's between us isn't serious enough to acknowledge. Those are both terrible options." "They are," Kian admitted, "but avoiding the choice isn't actually a third option, no matter how much I wish it were. Desmond will use either path against me if given the chance. The only real question is which battle we choose to fight." Elena thought of the anonymous email, the careful phrasing that had made clear just how much danger her connection to Kian already carried, and weighed it against the quiet, stubborn feeling that had settled into her chest weeks ago and refused every attempt to talk it away. "If I stood beside you at that gathering, in front of the entire court, what would that actually mean? For me, practically. It would mean every person in that room would know exactly who you are, and exactly what you mean to me. It would mean Desmond's faction would have a much harder time pretending you're simply a passing distraction to be waited out. It would also mean," he added, more quietly, "that you would become, formally and publicly, a target in a world built on politics far older and more ruthless than anything you've encountered so far. And if I don't go, then I go alone, and I let the court believe whatever story serves them best, and I spend every day afterward wondering whether I chose safety over the one thing in years that's made me feel like an actual person, instead of a symbol wearing a crown." Elena reached across the small table and covered his hand with her own, the gesture surprising them both with its steadiness. "I spent my last coins on a stranger because I was too tired to keep carrying everything alone. I didn't expect that stranger to turn out to be a king, and I definitely didn't expect to end up standing at the edge of a decision this large, but I'm tired of being someone things happen to. I'd rather be someone who chooses, even if the choice is frightening." "Are you saying you'll come to the gathering?" "I'm saying," Elena said, "that I want a few days to actually think it through properly, rather than answering in the middle of a diner at midnight, purely because your hand is warm, and I like the way you're looking at me right now." A real smile broke across Kian's face then, unguarded and boyish, in a way that made him look, for just a moment, less like the Alpha King burdened by centuries of expectation, and more like a man who'd simply found something worth smiling about. "That's fair. Take your time." Outside the diner window, the city continued its ordinary late-night rhythm, entirely unaware that inside, a decision was quietly taking shape that would, within a matter of weeks, ripple outward into a world of pacts and politics far larger than either of them had imagined when a handful of desperate coins first brought them together. Elena's mother noticed the change before Elena ever found the words to explain it, watching her daughter move around their small apartment over the following days with a distracted energy that hadn't been there before, humming under her breath while washing dishes, staring at her phone longer than any single message required. "You've met someone," her mother said one evening, her voice still carrying the faint rasp of the illness that had improved only slightly since the new medicine started working. "I may be sick, Elena, but I'm not blind." Elena sat down on the edge of her mother's bed, weighing how much of the truth she could safely share with a woman already worn thin by worry over medical bills and a cough that wouldn't fully clear. "It's complicated, Mama. Everything worth having usually is." Her mother reached out and took her hand, her grip weaker than it used to be but still carrying the same steady warmth Elena remembered from childhood. "Tell me only what you're comfortable telling me, but tell me if he's kind. That's the only part I actually need to know." "He's kind," Elena said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. "He's also complicated, and there are people in his life who don't want him to be with someone like me, and it might get difficult before it gets easier." "Difficult how?" Elena hesitated, then decided her mother deserved at least the shape of the truth, if not every specific detail. "He comes from a very powerful family, old money, old power, the kind that comes with its own rules and its own enemies. There are people around him who think I'm not good enough, and one of them has already tried to frighten me into stepping away." Her mother's grip tightened. "And are you frightened?" A little, but not enough to leave. Something like pride flickered across her mother's tired face. Your father used to say the same thing about me. You know, my family didn't approve of him at first, thought he was beneath our name, beneath what they'd imagined for me. He never once let their disapproval decide anything for him. He simply kept showing up, kept being exactly who he was, until eventually even the people who doubted him couldn't deny what was standing right in front of them. What happened to change their minds? Time, patience, and your father refusing, every single day, to shrink himself down to fit anyone else's comfort. Her mother's eyes, tired as they were, carried a spark of the woman she must have been before illness and hard years wore some of the brightness away. If this man of yours is worth the difficulty, Elena, then face it. Don't let anyone's disapproval convince you that you're smaller than you actually are. Elena carried those words with her over the following days, turning them over during quiet moments at the Vance house, during the long bus rides home. During the evenings she spent on the phone with Kian discussing logistics for the gathering that loomed closer with each passing day. Security arrangements. What she should wear. How she should address members of the court she'd never met and didn't yet fully understand the hierarchy of. You don't need to memorize a script, Kian told her during one such call, amusement warming his voice despite the seriousness of the topic. Just be honest. Most of the court will be watching to see how you carry yourself, not whether you know the exact correct title for every minor pack leader in the room. Easy for you to say. You grew up in that world. I grew up terrified of that world, if it makes you feel any better. I simply had no choice but to learn quickly. A pause, then, more gently. You don't have to do this, Elena. If the closer we get to the gathering, the more it feels like too much, you can still say no. I would understand. I know. Elena stared out her small window at the darkening street below, the same street she'd once stood on watching for a car that took weeks to finally stop. But I keep thinking about something my mother said, about not shrinking myself down to fit other people's comfort. I spent years being invisible in the Vance house, careful never to take up too much space, never to be too much trouble. I'm tired of being small because it's safer. I'd rather be exactly who I am, and let the court figure out what to do with that. The warmth in Kian's silence was almost audible. Then I'll see you at the gathering. 2 days before the event, Margaret arrived at Elena's apartment again, this time carrying a garment bag draped carefully over one arm, and an expression of brisk determination that left no room for argument. His Majesty wanted you to have something appropriate, Margaret said, hanging the bag on the back of Elena's door with the efficient precision of someone who'd handled 1,000 such deliveries before. I told him appropriate was the wrong word entirely. You don't need to look appropriate for that room, Miss Torres. You need to look like you belong in it. Because you do. Elena unzipped the bag slowly, revealing a deep blue gown that seemed to catch what little light filtered through her small window. Simple in its design, but clearly, unmistakably expensive in every stitch and seam. This is too much. It's exactly enough, Margaret corrected. And before you protest further, I'll remind you that the women who will be watching you most closely at that gathering have spent their entire lives being dressed by people who understood exactly how much armor a good gown can provide. You'll need every bit of that armor tonight, so accept the gift gracefully and let it do its job. Elena ran her fingers along the fabric, thinking of the empty envelope that had started all of this, the coins she'd counted 3 times before finding nothing left, the desperate booking that had somehow led her to this exact moment, standing in her small rented room holding a gown fit for a queen. Margaret, she said quietly, do you think I can actually do this? Stand in that room and hold my own against people who've spent their whole lives learning how to undermine each other? Margaret studied her for a long moment, something warm and certain settling into her sharp features. Miss Torres, I have spent 11 years watching that court chew through people far more prepared than you currently are, purely because those people believed the room's power belonged only to those born into it. You have something most of them lost decades ago. You have nothing to prove and everything to be honest about. In a room built entirely on performance, honesty is the rarest weapon anyone can bring to the table. Elena held on to those words as tightly as she held the fabric of the gown, and when Margaret finally left, she stood alone in her small room a long while, staring at the deep blue dress hanging against the cracked paint of her door, feeling for the first time genuinely ready to face whatever the gathering intended to throw at her. The gathering was held in a hall Elena hadn't seen during her earlier visit to the estate, a vast chamber with vaulted ceilings and stone walls hung with old banners representing packs whose names meant nothing to her yet, but clearly meant everything to the hundreds of people filling the room. Firelight from enormous hearths at either end threw moving shadows across faces that turned, one by one, toward the entrance as Elena walked in beside Kian, her hand steady in his despite the roar of her own pulse in her ears. The whispers started immediately, a low ripple moving through the crowd faster than sound should reasonably travel, dozens of eyes assessing her in the space of a few seconds, cataloging everything from her dress to her posture, to the careful, deliberate way Kian kept her hand in his, rather than releasing it once they'd crossed the threshold. "Steady," Kian murmured, so quietly only she could hear it. "You're doing fine." They made their way through the receiving line, an endless procession of pack leaders and court officials offering greetings that ranged from genuinely warm to icily polite, each one testing her with a slightly different angle of scrutiny. Elena kept her spine straight and her voice level, remembering Margaret's advice, offering honesty rather than performance whenever a question caught her off guard. Desmond found them near the center of the hall, flanked by two younger men Elena assumed were his sons, his smile pleasant enough to fool anyone who hadn't already been warned about the anonymous email sitting unopened in her inbox at home. "Miss Torres." His voice carried a practiced warmth that didn't quite reach his eyes. What a pleasure to finally meet the woman who's caused such interesting conversation across the court these past weeks. "Lord Ashgrove." Elena kept her tone even, refusing to let the flicker of fear in her stomach reach her face. "I've heard a great deal about you as well. All flattering, I hope." His smile sharpened slightly at the edges. "Tell me, Miss Torres, how does a maid from the human world find herself navigating a room like this one? It must be rather overwhelming, coming from such humble circumstances into such an old and complicated tradition." The insult was wrapped carefully in the language of polite curiosity, but every person nearby understood exactly what he was doing, testing her composure in front of an audience that would remember how she responded. "It is overwhelming," Elena agreed, refusing to flinch from the truth of it. "I've spent my life cleaning floors in houses that weren't mine, quiet enough not to be noticed, careful enough not to cause trouble. This room is very different from anything I've known, but I've found that most rooms, no matter how grand, still run on the same basic things: honesty, respect, a willingness to see the person standing in front of you, rather than only the label attached to them." She held his gaze steadily. "I imagine that's true here as much as it was true scrubbing floors, though I suspect some people in rooms like this one have simply forgotten it." A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the small crowd gathered near them, several older pack leaders exchanging glances that carried something like grudging approval. Desmond's smile thinned, the practiced warmth cooling into something harder, before he mastered his expression back into pleasantness. "Well said, Miss Torres." He inclined his head slightly, the gesture carrying more challenge than courtesy. "I look forward to seeing how well that philosophy serves you as the evening continues." He moved on, his sons trailing after him, and Kian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around Elena's own. "You handled that better than most seasoned diplomats I've watched navigate him. I was terrified the entire time. You didn't look it. That's what matters in this room." The evening wore on through formal proceedings Elena only partially understood. Alliance renewals recited in careful, ceremonial language. Disputes between smaller packs settled with Kian's measured judgment, the entire hierarchy of a world she was only beginning to grasp playing out in real time before her eyes. She watched him work the room with an authority that felt entirely different from the quiet, careful man who'd sat across from her in a rented apartment weeks earlier, and understood, more clearly than Margaret's explanations had managed, exactly how much weight he carried every single day. It was near the end of the formal proceedings, during a lull between ceremonial matters, that Desmond rose again, this time addressing the full assembled court, rather than Elena alone. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. "Given the significance of tonight's gathering, and given the rather public nature of your recent personal choices, I believe the court deserves clarity on a matter of succession. Specifically, whether your continued association with a human woman represents a passing indulgence, or whether we should prepare ourselves for the possibility of a human influence within the bloodline that has governed this territory for 11 generations. The hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes swinging between Desmond and Kian, waiting. Kian rose from his seat slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the hesitation Elena had seen from him in quieter moments, only the full, settled authority of a man who had made his decision and intended to defend it without apology. "I have spent 11 years on this throne," he said, his voice ringing clearly across the hall, "making every choice with the good of this pack foremost in my mind. I have sacrificed relationships, personal comfort, and any semblance of an ordinary life in service of a crown I inherited rather than chose. Tonight, for perhaps the first time since my father died, I am making a choice entirely for myself, and I make no apology for it." He turned, extending his hand toward Elena, who rose to stand beside him despite the roar of her own pulse, meeting the full weight of the court's attention without looking away. Elena Torres is not a passing indulgence, Kian continued, his voice steady and clear. She is the first person in over a decade to look at me and see a man rather than a crown, and I would rather lose the support of every faction in this room than lose that. If this court cannot accept a leader who has chosen honesty over convenient politics, then perhaps this court has forgotten what leadership was ever meant to look like. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena's heart nearly stopped entirely, before, slowly, one pack leader near the front of the hall began to applaud, followed by another, and another, the sound building until it filled the vaulted chamber, a wave of approval that left Desmond standing alone amid his own faction, his expression carefully composed but unmistakably furious beneath the surface. Elena stood beside Kian in the firelight, the weight of hundreds of eyes settling on her not as a threat now but as something closer to acceptance, and understood, standing there in a gown that had once seemed too much for a maid who'd spent her last coins on a stranger, that whatever came next, she would face it exactly as she was, without shrinking, without apology, beside a man who had chosen her as deliberately and completely as she had chosen him. The weeks following the gathering brought changes Elena couldn't have predicted the night she'd counted an empty envelope for the third time, hoping coins might appear from nowhere, to save her from a math problem that refused to balance. Desmond did not disappear quietly. Word reached Kian within days that his uncle had begun quiet conversations with several smaller pack leaders, testing the waters for support should he decide to challenge the succession more directly. But the applause that had filled the hall the night of the gathering had shifted something fundamental in the court's mood. Enough that Desmond's usual allies grew notably more cautious about openly aligning against a king who had, in one evening, demonstrated more conviction than most of them had seen from him in years. "It isn't over," Kian told Elena one evening. The two of them sitting in the modest apartment she still refused to leave, despite his gentle, repeated offers of something larger, safer, closer to the estate. "Desmond will keep looking for an opening. Men like him don't stop simply because one plan failed." "I know." Elena leaned against his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight fade outside her small window. "But I'd rather face an ongoing fight standing beside you than a quiet, comfortable life spent wondering what I gave up out of fear." Her mother's health improved steadily over the following month, the stronger medicine finally clearing the wet cough that had frightened Elena so badly, color returning gradually to a face that had grown too thin during the hardest months. Kian arranged, quietly and without fanfare, for a specialist to review her case, refusing every attempt Elena made to thank him properly, insisting simply that family mattered, and her mother was, by every measure that counted, already becoming his. Mrs. Vance eventually noticed the changes too, the discreet security presence that occasionally shadowed Elena's movements, the increasingly transparent gossip circulating through the household staff, and rather than the dismissal Elena had half expected, offered instead a stiff, awkward sort of respect once the full picture became clear, along with a notably improved schedule that finally kept her out of Mr. Vance's uncomfortable orbit for good. Priya, predictably, refused to let the matter rest without extracting every detail Elena was willing to share, delighted beyond measure that the $40 booking she'd arranged out of concern for her friend's sanity had somehow resulted in Elena standing before an entire court and holding her ground against a scheming uncle with centuries of practiced cruelty behind him. "I'm putting this on my resume," Priya announced one afternoon, only half joking. "Successfully arranged the romance of the century using $20 found in a coat pocket. You stole that $20. Semantics. The point stands." It was 3 months after the gathering, on an ordinary evening that carried none of the formal weight of court proceedings or anonymous threats, that Kian took Elena's hand across the same small diner table where so much of their story had already unfolded, the cracked vinyl booth and jingling bell above the door, as familiar to both of them now as any grander setting the estate could offer. "I've been thinking," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands, a habit she'd long since stopped finding strange, about how this all started. A booking made out of desperation, a companion service meant for lonely strangers, the last coins you had to your name spent on someone you never expected to matter. "I think about it constantly," Elena admitted, "how different everything could have gone if Priya hadn't stolen that $20, if you'd been booked by someone else that night, if I'd said no the way every reasonable instinct told me to." "I'm glad you didn't." Kian reached into his coat pocket, and Elena's breath caught at the small velvet box he set carefully on the table between them, plain and unassuming, entirely unlike the grand, ceremonial jewels she'd seen at the gathering weeks earlier. "I asked Margaret's advice on this, actually, since I have absolutely no practical experience proposing to anyone. She told me not to overthink it. Said the simplest, most honest version of the truth would matter more than any elaborate gesture. And what's the simplest version of the truth? That I have been Alpha King for 11 years, responsible for territory and politics and a bloodline that stretches back further than either of us can properly imagine. And in all that time, no single thing has felt as clear or as right as the moment you stood beside me in that hall and refused to shrink from a room built to intimidate you into silence. He opened the box, revealing a ring simple in its design, elegant without excess. Nothing like the ostentatious jewels she might have expected from a man of his standing. I don't need a queen who understands every political maneuver in that court. I need someone who sees me clearly, the way you did the very first night we met, before you knew anything about crowns or pacts or politics. I would like that person to be you, for the rest of however long we're both given. Elena stared at the ring, then at the man holding it, thinking of the empty envelope, the desperate coins, the stranger who'd noticed everything and asked for nothing, the king who'd stood before his entire court and chosen her without apology. Yes, she said, the word arriving without hesitation, steady and certain in a way that surprised even her. Yes, completely. The bell above the diner door jingled as a new customer wandered in from the cold, entirely oblivious to the quiet, enormous moment unfolding in the corner booth. And Elena laughed through unexpected tears as Kian slid the ring onto her finger with hands that, for the first time since she'd known him, actually trembled. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever Desmond continued to scheme in the shadows of a court that measured worth in bloodlines and politics, Elena understood, sitting in that small diner with a king's ring on her finger, and a future stretching out ahead of her far larger and stranger than anything she could have imagined, that she had found something no amount of careful counting could ever have predicted the night her coins ran out entirely. She had found someone who saw her, completely, exactly as she was, and had chosen her anyway, crown and all.